The Battle of Santa Cruz is a bit of a weird battle in that the Japanese teared up to be this sort of decisive battle, and it is a victory in some sense for them, but it's also not. It's characterized as being a Pyrrhic victory, but let's be honest, they're fighting for sea control so they can support a land battle they've already lost. They're fighting to try and regain the initiative in a war where they are already about to be outnumbered and outproduced. The US is warming up to start building the Essex Swarm. And by the Essex Swarm, I mean the Essex Swarm. At this point, when we're talking about October 1942, there is already, in fact, launched, is Essex herself. She was launched in July 1942. Bonhomme Richard, which will become Yorktown, has had a keel laid as of December 1941 and is soon going to be launched. Intrepid, also keel laid December 1941 and is going to be launched in April 1943. And Kearsarge, which will become Hornet, well, she was laid down in August 1942. So in simple terms, the US Navy is already starting to build up. Already starting to grow and lay down these things, and the forces coming through. And it's one of those scenarios where you get into almost a discussion like you do around Jutland, which is, oh yeah, the British lost some ships. That's not good. That is a bad thing. No one wants to lose ships. How quickly did the British replace those ships? How quickly did the Germans get their ships back in the service? And that's the trouble. When you're a smaller power, and it doesn't matter how much smaller you are, but when you're a smaller power, you always have to balance the losses you inflict on your opponent versus how quickly they can replenish the losses versus how much they affect the battle. If your enemy has 30 carriers and you sink one, they have 29. But if you started off with 6 carriers and they've taken 2 of them out of action and you may or may not get them back in service anytime soon, you're down to 4. And the ultimate problem is going from 6 to 4 is a massive loss in capability. That's a third of your force gone. Going from 30 to 29, the question is, are you really going to notice it in the aggregate? Are you really going to go, dang, if I had one more carrier, there's something I would really like to do with it? Or is it, once you've got things being serviced, maintained, rotated through the various things, honestly, that 1 in 30 is going to disappear as a functional problem that you're really stressing over. Yes, it would make everything a little bit easier to have it, but it's not going to cause you that much trouble to lose it. And this is the trouble with trying to achieve a decisive battle, and this is why I don't think this was an attempt to achieve a decisive battle. I really don't. I think the whole Guadalcanal Campaign, in some regards, we'll get into this, was the Americans and the Japanese fighting over who was going to control the initiative and the pace of the war. And you cannot achieve a decisive battle if you cannot seize the initiative, if you can't force the Americans to play to your tune. Because remember, a decisive battle for the Japanese is the Americans coming in with a large proportion of their force at a disadvantage, acting in a stupid way, so they run into their attrition tactics, and then the Japanese can defeat whatever's left, and so can win the war, like they did with the Russians at Tsushima, etc., and various other things, where the geography attrited them. The trouble was the Americans were never A, that inclined to play that stupid, and B, were also never that low on resources. The thing about the Russo-Japanese War, which is often forgotten, is that realistically, Russia and Japan are peers in that conflict. It's a peer-on-peer conflict. In World War II, Japan is not America's peer in terms of strength. They're their technological peer. Don't get me wrong, they're their technological peer, but they're not their peer in terms of strength. It's the discussion I usually have is when the 1920s and 30s, there are 2 major powers who have the infrastructure and the sheer volume of resources available to actually wage the war on the scale we're talking about, and that's the British Empire and America. And yes, the British Empire is I don't think you can really argue it's on an upward swing, but it's not exactly on a downward swing at that particular point. It's dealing with the troubles, it's getting over the issues it's had, and it's battling one big problem after another, so it's not exactly in a good situation, but no one is in that 20s and 30s realistically. But the thing is, it still has a huge amount of infrastructure at its disposal, it still has a huge amount of force at its disposal, and still has, not just on paper, but in reality, a huge amount of capability. Japan doesn't have that. Japan doesn't have that. So there's a problem when we get to the Battle of Santa Cruz. It is fighting for the initiative, and by the way, any battle which has as many names as this does for it is just a cool one. The fact that it can be called the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, the Battle of Santa Cruz, the Third Battle of the Solomon Sea, or the Battle of the South Pacific Sea, all these different options for naming it does lead people to have fun with it. And I once watched in a debate where two historians arguing in a conference. They were arguing over which battle was the fourth major carrier battle of World War II in the Pacific. And please note, they did use that criteria, which was quite nice. So it was quite good. And they were arguing between the Battle of Santa Cruz and the Battle of the South Pacific. And I had the fun thing of pointing out after they'd been arguing for a good 15-20 minutes that they were arguing over the same battle. At which point one of them finally consulted Google. It's always fun. It's always fun. But we'll leave that to one side. They did consult Google, and finally they had the argument was over. But yeah, this was their fourth major naval battle of the major carrier battle of the Pacific War. And the difference with carrier battles, especially battles in this period, to the traditional battles prior to this, is that they are fought with the enablers. They're fought with the carriers providing space for the aircraft and the aircraft going off and fighting. It's, again, the difference. There is a big difference in fighting traditional battleship, where you're in gunnery range and you're fighting on the values of the individual ships and the capabilities of ships. And the onus is entirely on them. When you're in a what is probably better to call as an air-sea battle or a carrier battle, your fleets are very rarely going to see each other. You're going to be all about the carrier aircraft coming in and the positions they get and what they achieve. And it's kind of like we see with modern missile warfare and modern engagements in terms of naval warfare. The engagement ranges are so great, and there's a lot of tactical thought that goes into them, a lot of capability, that it's the technology in terms of the weapon systems, as in the aircraft and the weapons they're deploying, which can be the deciding factor. Your carriers, which are your decisive ships in this scenario, because they can carry these air groups, they're not actually decisive in terms of their own firepower. They're decisive in terms of what aircraft are put in their hangars. It's one of the reasons why there's a great big difference when people start talking about battleships versus carriers, and the carrier will have its day and it'll be replaced by this. Ultimately, the carrier is not the weapon system. The carrier is the support of the weapon systems. And it's the aircraft inside which you have to decide whether they've had their day. So ultimately, when we stop using aircraft in the way we're using them, or either crewed or uncrewed, is when the carrier will go. Until then, you're going to need a carrier vessel of some kind, some description. And that's the fun thing. But in terms of the Battle of the Santa Cruz and the fact of the Battle of Santa Cruz and the fact that it's this whole battle taking place, what the Japanese are trying to do is they are trying to provide cover for the army to take Henderson Field and Guadalcanal. They're trying to do that because if they can control Guadalcanal, they can dictate the resupply to extent of Australia. They can impact the movement of the forces, and also they can divide the American forces and American commands. You know, we often talk about Nimitz's command area versus MacArthur's command area. Well, if you control Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, etc., in these areas, you can divide that. In theory, you have to have the forces to actually do it, but in practice, which is the big trouble for the Japanese, actually having the forces to do it. But it's a good theory. In practice, it sucks. In practice, the Americans realised this. The Americans launched a campaign to take these territories and also to use these islands and these fort positions as a way to maneuver to take Rabaul, which is the key base for the Japanese in this region. And the thing about it is, the Americans don't turn up with a pencil and a rubber and a pencil sharpener and go, "That's me prepared for school." They turn up with a laptop. They turn up with a full pencil and pen case stuffed to the brim with utensils. They turn up with pads, note paper, and textbooks. They turn up with everything. They bring the whole school bag with them. And yeah, the Japanese can't deal with that. Because the Japanese are at the end of their logistics line. The Japanese are at the end of a very exposed logistics line, which is being cut as often as possible by the US Naval Submarine Force. And this is what they're wrestling with. And so then to throw into that mix, okay, let's send a carrier batter force down there to support them and hopefully cut off the naval support for the forces on the islands and fighting up Guadalcanal. It's a nice idea. But again, how are you going to do it? And one of the fun things about this battle is when you start looking at the forces involved and you compare them to what their forces they were deploying in the earlier part of the war, at Midway and Coral Sea. And the reason I don't like to put this battle as necessarily a victory for the Japanese, and I don't even say Pyrrhic victory for the Japanese as a rule when I'm talking about it, is because when we consider the losses of personnel, and that was the really important thing, the Americans lost 266, the Japanese lost between 400 and 500, and that's an estimate. Of those, about 148 were pilots and aircrew. That's a problem. Remember, the Japanese are having trouble with their pipeline, their training pipeline. They're having trouble replacing crews, and especially early in the war, and the losses in the first year or so of the war are taking big gouges out of their pre-war experienced veterans because they aren't cycling them back to train the next generation. They aren't doing what is probably best to preserve that institutional memory. And that's where this battle really does matter. It's a lesson for all powers, I think, especially modern nations, about the importance of the institutional memory and keeping it alive. And this is something I see treated not just in wartime but also in peacetime these days. The amount of people who are prepared to sacrifice, especially other services, institutional memory in order to preserve something of their own service. I always worry when it comes to defence funding time and the debates over defence funding, and you get someone, let's say, from, let's call it the ground forces, offering up something which is incredibly important to the air forces, but no, we don't need this anymore, and certainly if you get rid of this, you can invest in this in my service. Or, you know what's best is if you give or someone from the air service going, you can give all these assets to us, and we'll look after them, because that's worked out so well in the past when they have been the priority assets for them, and you can claim your existence is to be an enabler force. But that means if you're an enabler force, should you be an independent service? I don't think they realise the problems with that particular argument. We keep a whole force going as an independent force of an independent structure to enable the other services. Sounds like it should be a command in those services where it's suitable, doesn't it? Not a separate command. That was the whole problem that air forces were wrestling with in the 20s and 30s. So it's always fun when someone today inadvertently reopens up that one. I'm not going to get in that particular Twitter debate. I just found it funny when they did. Or someone from the sea service goes, "Oh, we don't need this element of the ground forces or this element of the air forces." And I go, no. Make the case for your own equipment. Make the case for your own institutional memory. Don't keep giving people arguments for cutting the rest. But that is diverting off the topic of today's discussion. But, well, the thing is, it kind of also illustrates today's discussion, because this is a battle, as said, about gaining the initiative in the war to dictate the pace of the war, which is the only way Japan can actually have a chance of doing anything. But it's also a battle which has a colossal effect on the war in terms of killing off a large part of that institutional memory that was still remaining in the Japanese forces. It was them throwing a dice and losing yet more of their experienced aviators, and then they're lurching in 1943-44 to try and fix that problem. And that's what they are doing. They're lurching around. But anyway, it's time for the Shameless book plug. And the Shameless book plug is a cool thing to me, because I get to plug not only my book. This is what I've decided now, is I get to plug other books. You know, I've got this one sitting next to me, Combined Fleet. And I'm going to be doing a Christmas book recommendations thing, but this is Mark Styles' book on the Japanese Combined Fleet, 1941-42. It's really nicely illustrated, really interesting to read. I've got a few in the series. In fact, I've got pretty much all the series I've been able to grab over the years. And lots of other interesting books around at the moment about the naval campaign in the Pacific and what happened during World War II in the Pacific, and they're worthwhile reading. One of the things I get into trouble with people is I draw a line. The thing is, we learn more about history as we do more research. And yes, that can change our perspective on things. It can change our perspective on people. We can learn that someone who, instead of being the person who was key to deciding something, was merely the front person for the team. Or we can learn that someone who is always pictured as being a strong, decisive solo leader was actually, in effect, far more of a team worker and a leader of a team, and their skills were they formed a really good team around them. Which is, in a way, nicer to learn about, and also more useful to learn about, because that is the essence of command, is building teams, really. And the point about history, and this is when I get into trouble, is that some colleagues like to and some people like to portray, we discover more history, this changes history. It doesn't. History still happened the way it did. What might change is our perspective or our level of our understanding of events. We might understand it on different layers. And it's also, there is the fact that there's layers to history. There's the strategic wars. This great book here. Good example. This is a really cool book. It's by Andrew Boyd. It's on arms for Russia, and it's all about naval war in the Arctic in 1941-45. And it's a really interesting read. It has one thing in there which is my greatest bugbear of all time. It doesn't list the name of destroyers. It'll go, there's this carrier involved, this cruiser involved, this capital ship involved, and give the name, and then it'll go, and 6 destroyers. Which 6 destroyers? Now, the thing is, this is a strategic study. In many ways, it's a strategic overview. It's all those things. And it's okay to do it. But if you were doing a tactical battle study and you did that, you would be laughed out of the room. Now, does that mean one of them is rewriting history? No. It means the level they're looking at, the information they're looking at, is different. And I might find it personally annoying. But that's because I really care about destroyers, and I find it really annoying when they're written, when they are literally summed down to, and 6 destroyers. That's my personal bugbear. That's still an excellent book, and Andy's a really, really nice guy and a really great historian, and I have massive respect for him. Just every time he writes 6 destroyers or various things like that in that book, I would also like to chuck model destroyers at him. Literally, but that might damage the model, so I probably wouldn't do that. But, that's the sort of thing. The point is that if you dress it up as saying, when we start talking about these things, you've changed history, you haven't. You've provided more detail. And that's the wonderful thing we're dealing with at the moment. There are a lot of great historians working, and a lot of very passionate people working to provide us with more detail. And that's a good thing. That's a really cool thing as well. Because that's how you learn from the past, by having more detail and being able to discuss it at the different levels. So, thank you for all your support. Thank you everyone who has bought copies of the book and who supports the channel by super chats and super thanks and all those things. It makes all this work possible because I'm completely funded by you. My research, all my historical work is completely funded by you. And that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned because, honestly, you are far less demanding than most grant committees. You are far less restrictive than the grant committees. As a rule, most of the viewers, what they require from me is that I do the best I can and trying to provide the most fulsome videos I can. And I'm happy to do that. I enjoy doing that. And the books as well. They seem to enjoy this one. Hopefully there'll be more soon. You know, it's more and more thinking it's going to be March next year as a birthday present to myself, but we'll never know. Might get them out quicker. Might. There's always a chance. It depends on fundings and probably the historiathon. But anyway, back to the topic at hand. Well, let's consider the war in the Pacific so far. And one of the reasons why I'm talking about this loss of institutional memory. If we consider the Battle of Coral Sea, again, often considered to an extent a Japanese victory, to an extent a Japanese loss. Why? Because again, they lose more than the Americans did. They had 966 killed. The Americans lost 715. The Battle of Midway, definitely an American victory. And again, the Japanese lost roughly 3,000 killed. And then there's the Battle of Eastern Solomons, the third major carrier battle of the war, where the Japanese losses run again to the extent of 300 or so. And the Americans less than 100. There is a growing theme here. Even the battles which are questionable and potentially American losses, they are losing less people. They are losing less in the aggregate. And that's a problem when they're already starting out with a larger force. It doesn't make the losses individually any less important or any less worth, something you would rather avoid and rather not happen. In fact, I have to say that shows the fraught world of history that people would actually be accused of that when you're talking about this. But what I'm saying is, for the Americans, their aggregate losses starting from a larger place and they've lost less people means they've had far less of an impact on their force, and they're able to build up experience and institutional memory with each engagement, each operation. They're able to grow. For the Japanese, starting off in a smaller place anyway, losing more, and having a system which also doesn't cycle back leaders and experienced personnel to go back and train and form up new units and bring them out at the same pace and in the same similar manner as the British and the American forces were doing, meant that they were losing that institutional memory at a far greater level. This is a problem. So this is despite the fact that the Japanese are probably heading towards their greatest extent. Their advances in 1942 have grown their force and have grown their control of the world, control of the Pacific, to the greatest it ever gets to. And they do this at a speed and a pace which is frankly amazing, but also not so surprising when you realise the forces and the supply lines of their forces which they were up against. Again, when we start sort of expanding this map, and this is quite a good map for this, when you realise that the American supply centre was based on the Philippines, the British supply centre was based on Singapore, which had been exposed by government financial mismanagement in the 20s and 30s and lack of investment, and by some very poor decisions at the beginning of World War II and some necessary decisions during World War II when forces had to be moved from Eastern forces and Indian Ocean forces to the Mediterranean, to the Atlantic, to take part in the ongoing battles there, because you always have to prioritise the war you're fighting rather than the war you're deterring. You always have to prioritize the war you're fighting. It's just a sad fact of life. In that scenario, it suddenly becomes slightly more understandable. The Japanese are able to use their ability to maneuver and their ability to dominate the oceanic sphere in this area to their advantage, to maneuver around forces, to entrap them, encircle them, ensnare them, and, well, in the ensuing fight, destroy them or overrun them. But the moment you start reaching places where there is an actual infrastructure supply, where there is an actual logistics supply, where these forces are actually being supported, are actually being sustained, the Japanese forces start to run into trouble. You know, one of the things they do, which is very interesting, is to make the advantage of jungle warfare is they run very light. Their forces move very light, which means that they are almost a version of blitzkrieg in the jungle, which is really devastating, up until you run into someone who has actually got a heavily fortified position and has got troops who are willing to hold it, because they're being supplied and sustained and can hold it. It's one of the comments that often comes up about Singapore. It's more of a failure of tactical and command in the local area than is a failure of the troops or a failure of the forces. It's the tactical command. And in fact, it breaks down. It's not getting the personnel organised properly. They haven't planned. They haven't dealt with the scenario. Even though the Japanese have been coming closer and closer, they haven't worked out how to defend Singapore as if it's been a mental block. They haven't plotted the forces. They haven't gone, hang on, where's a really good place to secure? Oh, the water reservoir. And there's already defences being built there to secure it during the 30s. Oh, amazing! Someone thought about this. So we just had to put the troops into the prepared defences. Yeah, no one thought about that. And again, who do we tend to blame that on? We blame the commanders. We go, nice way, that's your fault. You're in command. And that's aggregate for blaming not just the commanders, but also their staff. It's blaming all of them. The commanders are one name, but it's the staff that are responsible as well. Everyone's at fault. There's plenty of blame to go around in that scenario. But as you notice, if you look at this, there are some key areas where the Japanese are pushing closer and closer to the vital supply lines. And this is where the fight back really starts to begin. Because whilst you have the Coral Sea, whilst you have Midway, whilst you have the Battle of Eastern Solomons to extent, and Eastern Solomons is part of the Guadalcanal Campaign in many ways. Well, it is part of the Guadalcanal Campaign, there is no two ways about it. It's a key enabler for it all. The people who try and make it differentiated are a bit weird, actually. But the thing that delivers the coup de grace is the Battle of Santa Cruz. Because at that point, the Japanese realise, we're not going to win this one. Even though they've already lost on land, they think they can redouble their efforts and maybe take Henderson Field, maybe don't. But when they lose Santa Cruz, there's no chance. There is no chance. At that point, the Guadalcanal Campaign becomes more about a withdrawal than it becomes about a victory. And if you consider it runs from the 7th of August 1942 to February 1943, and we are talking about October 1942, that tells you how quickly it turns. August, September, October. And then it's, well, let's be honest, it's November, December, January, and all over by 9th of February. It doesn't even make it a Valentine's Day. 43. And Guadalcanal, as said, is important because of controlling the supply routes to Australia. Because that's the other trouble the Japanese are facing, is that the supply routes are over these vast distances. These convoys are running a long way away from Japan. They're not running towards Japan, they're running away from Japan. You could argue in some regards they're running parallel to Japan, but it's not like the Battle Atlantic, where the Germans just happen to be the other side of the British, and they have bases in France and Norway, and they can therefore converge on those areas, so you're running into them, or the Arctic, when you're running around their positions. No, this is the Pacific, where, whilst you can still put in threats, and they will still try and threaten convoys with various means, those convoys are basically coming down from up here, and they're coming along down there. And that's a long way from Japanese territory. That's a long way from Japanese infrastructure and support. Remember, they stretch themselves to get this space. They really do stretch themselves. And yeah, they are in a situation where they are trying to take territory so they can threaten these things, and they can't, because they're now running into the kind of opposition which is supplied, which does have the infrastructure, which does have the logistics behind it, which means the Japanese maneuver cannot make up, and speed of maneuver and their pace of advance cannot make up for their lack of other resources, their lack of heavy weapons. It's one of those scenarios where Elan and your vivre and your emotion is not going. No matter how much passion, how much for the Emperor you shout, you're just not going to be able to overcome the sheer quantity of machine guns and mortars. And if you look into the Guadalcanal campaign, especially the defensive battles, it is machine guns and mortars, and a never-ending supply of ammunition for both, which defines those battles. So, with that being said, let's talk a bit about the Guadalcanal campaign and why it's come to this point. It's actually a really good example, the Guadalcanal, of the Japanese overstretch, because they achieved this position which allows them to threaten those lines of supply, and then they can't reinforce it, they can't supply it properly, they can't actually use it properly, because they haven't got the forces to do so with it. They've overextended themselves, but more importantly, they've overgorged themselves. They're like the person at the all-you-can-eat buffet who, at the first, you pick up the plate and it's the first, section of the buffet, they fill the plate up with everything, and then they realise they have to go back and eat that and then get another plate, because you're not allowed to have multiple plates. You at the same time going back, you just have the one plate. Instead of wandering around and actually taking their time and considering things properly, they have just filled up with the first stuff they've seen, which also tends to be the cheapest and easiest for the buffet to supply. I'm not saying there's some science going on in buffet design here, but the point is, with the Guadalcanal campaign, they've rushed this in, they've not got enough forces there, and then after Coral Sea and Midway, they are sort of surprised when the Allies go, we've got these people called the US Marine Corps. Yes. They specialize in amphibious operations. Yes. We're going to use them. At which point, they're less happy, because the Japanese really haven't got a lot of forces on the islands. In fact, honestly, it's kind of pathetic, the forces they have there, when you compare it to the forces they have arranged against them. The most doughty resistance they'll find is when they do the attack on Gavatu and Tanambogo. 3,000 US Marines land under the then Brigadier General William Rupertus, and they find roughly 900 IJN personnel manning a seaplane base and naval base on the islands, and they fight as hard as they can. In difference from that, and probably this does not improve relations between the IJN and the IJA, Talugi, Gavatu, and Tanambogo, in contrast to sort of that, the landings on Guadalcanal, well, 11,000 Marines came ashore. And they came ashore at 09:10 hours on the 7th of August, and by 1600 hours on the 8th of August, they had managed to secure the airfield, which would be later called Henderson Field. And when they got there, they found that the Japanese naval construction units and combat troops, all under command of another IJN officer, Captain Kane Mozen, had been pretty much overwhelmed, emotionally at least, by the warship bombardment and aerial bombing. had abandoned the area and withdrawn 3 miles to the Manicacu River and Point Cruz area. And this withdrawal, which had not been in the face of enemy ground forces, had also left behind their food, their supplies, their intact construction equipment and vehicles, and 13 dead. Now, the thing is, there are not enough personnel here. And when you start looking at the order of battle and what turns up, the first reaction from the Japanese, realizing that there is an entire Marine division being deployed. Remember, that's a Marine division is made up of 3 regiments of infantry, each of roughly 3 battalions, a regiment of artillery, and all the logistics and support staff it needs for it. That full division is there. That then gets other forces landed to support it, and eventually gets the 2nd Marine Division also being landed to support it. And eventually the Americal Division, the Army, comes in to replace them and relieve them. And 25th Infantry Division. But the Japanese 17th Army sends, first of all, the 28th Infantry Regiment, which had started to land on the 6th of July to begin construction of the airstrip. So their construction unit being there. And for something you really need for a jungle war scenario is that the 28th Infantry Regiment belonged to the 35th Brigade, which included the 124th Infantry Regiment, the 4th Artillery Regiment, which included the 10th and 20th Mountain Gun Battalions. Small problem there, just a small problem there. They then get later on reinforced by the 2nd Infantry Sendai Division, which does include 3 infantry regiments, an artillery regiment, an engineering battalion, and all those forces. And then eventually they get the 38th Infantry Division turning up. But you'll notice a small problem here. The Japanese forces are dribbling in as their forces can be brought there. The Americans are turned up en masse. The Americans are turning up with everything and the kitchen sink. And I mean everything and the kitchen sink. When you realise that the other Marine units which are attached to 1st Marine Division include the 3rd Defence Battalion, the 1st Parachute Battalion, the 1st Raider Battalion, the 1st Amphibian Tractor Battalion, and 1st Aviation Engineering Battalion, the 1st Pioneer Battalion, the 1st Medical Battalion, and Special Weapons Battalion. That's always a slightly worrying thing. And the 1st Tank Battalion. And it's always nice when the US Marine turn up with the first of everything. They've basically brought everything in the kitchen sink. And this is telling for what the war is going to turn into. You have the Japanese going, we've taken all this area, now to defend it. We have none of our resources able to be brought to bear. And fighting on a shoestring budget. And a shoestring resources. And the Americans turning up with everything. And yes, they're going to have times when they're going to run low. They're going to have times when they have problems. But the thing is, they turned up with everything to begin with, and now they have the challenge of supplying it. And yes, Guadalcanal is the first big time they try and do this. And they don't get it all right. They really don't get it all right. But they get enough right, and they learn enough lessons, so they get better at it, and better at it. And this is the reality of World War II in the Pacific. And the thing is, very quickly you learn that with these island battles, control the sea matters. Control the sea is what gives you the ability to actually achieve victory. And this is one of the reasons why, again, I do not agree with the argument that Santa Cruz is a victory, because the argument is that, well, the Americans leave and therefore the Japanese are left in control of the sea. Yes, I can see that argument, and that is quite an effective argument when talking about Jutland, etc. But the thing is, the British get left control of the sea and use it. The Americans are still using the sea. The Japanese get control, theoretically are left with control of the sea. They don't manage to use it to achieve anything. And the whole point is, you do not get control of the sea to sit there and go, I have control of the sea. You get it so you can do stuff with it. That often paraphrased joke about the British Army being being a projectile to be fired by the Royal Navy into Europe when it needs to be. It's both a horrendous joke and quite true. Because the point of the Navy is to get control of the sea, and one of the key uses of having control of the sea is you get to choose where you send your army. You can land it where it can do the most good for you. The Japanese get control of the sea, they've lost the battle. Do they get control of the sea? Well, they've lost less. They've lost their ships than the Americans, and the Americans have withdrawn because they've lost the ships they have, and they don't want to carry on fighting in that scenario. So yeah, you can argue they've won, but they've lost. The Japanese have also lost ships. They've lost more people, and they're not able to do anything with it. So I wouldn't call that a Pyrrhic victory. I'd call that at best, a draw. At worst, both sides have lost. And I know I keep coming back to discussing this battle in the wider context, but that's where it fits. It's important in the wider context. It's important in the context of the Guadalcanal Campaign, because one of the things that happens in this campaign is that the US Marines and the US Army have won it. Pretty much by the time we are talking about, they have won it. The battles ashore are pretty much over, and it's now a grinding pushback to make sure the Japanese have left the islands, but they've got control of it. And that's one of the reasons why eventually, again, the US Marines are replaced and the Army comes in, because it turns from being a naval sort of amphibious battle to being it's now a ground campaign. Okay, now our specialist troops, we can move on to the next place where we need them to prepare for that, and the ground forces can come and take over, because it's now just it's now just administrative logistic supply. So, with this being said, let's consider the mines involved. Now, each of these mines had to wrestle with massive tasks. One, how to use their minimal resources to try and best achieve something like a victory. Preferably a victory, but something like a victory that would allow the Japanese to dictate the peace. And in the case of the other, he's trying very hard to, well, how to put it, to successfully marshal the resources at his disposal. And that might not sound like a difficult task. Oh, yes, I have an abundance of ships. Whatever am I going to do with them? Oh, they're coming. Well, the trouble is he has a while to wait for that abundance to come in. He's getting a lot of resources chucked at him, but they're not necessarily able to be got where they need to be. And politicians are sometimes going, but we've assigned you 60 ships. Yes, but they're still working up, and they're nowhere near the level they need to be. Or, you've assigned you all these warships, but I've got no tankers. So he has to deliver results that firm up his position, allow him to keep the control of the war, which is necessary, and not have the level of interference which some other commanders around the world have been dealing with. And it's a constant challenge for both of them. They are waging a mental war against each other, and yes, they are betting other people's lives for it. And sometimes the tools they have at their disposal are imperfect. Whether they be human or machine, they can be imperfect, and they need to try and make allowances for that. One of the problems, for one, is a constant, well, in the case of Yamato, it's a constant grappling for resources, a constant tussle to get the resources necessary that he needs at all. And for Nimitz, it's a constant battle to get the resources in the right place. Make sure they're where he needs them to be. When he needs them to be. Guadalcanal, the wider campaign in this period, all these are major commitments of resources. You know, one of the big issues you have at Guadalcanal, and you have in the Battle of Santa Cruz especially, is that the resources being committed are not what either side would like to be there for the battle, but they're what are available, what are in theatre, and what they have working. And in the case of both sides, it's also what is still there. because both sides have lost. So putting your best foot forward to try and fight this battle is what you do to try and achieve the optimum result, but what that foot is, what your best foot is in this scenario, is probably what the foot you have that's still working. That's the best available foot, not the best foot you could have put forward. And it's up to these two, and they've set the stage. They've been trying to conduct and coordinate things with all the various politics. We often bring up the IJA, the Imperial Japanese Army versus the Imperial Japanese Navy, the arguments they were having. But there are other forces as well involved that are having severe arguments. And on this side, you have problems in senior command. You have politicians interfering for their special case, and people all trying to put forward different positions of command. At one point, MacArthur thought he could get command of everything in the Pacific. He honestly believed Nimitz would be made his admiral, and he would be supreme commander of the entire war against Japan. It didn't happen, but he was trying to make some senators push for it. There were other points other senators were trying to make putting Nimitz in charge of MacArthur, which honestly Nimitz didn't want. He went, "Look, I've already got grey hair, man. Do you want to have it all fall out?" No, he didn't seriously do that, but I could imagine the air would have been Rubenesque with hot words had the discussions actually been had with him. You have to remember, especially, that for everyone involved, this was war on a new scale. We talk about Napoleonic Wars being world wars, and they are. They are world wars. They are global wars. But you're talking about a world war, as in a global conflict where you're fighting in different theatres across the globe, in different continents, different oceans across the globe, as a constant, not just for a season or two, but as a constant throughout the conflict. In the total war industrial age. This is war on a scale which had never been witnessed before. One of the troubles I have with when you classify them as World War I and World War II, and the trouble is there isn't really a better classification available, but one of the troubles I have with them is it misses out the complete difference of scale between 1 and 2. One is a tremendously heartbreaking, heart-wrenching war, a grinding mill in the middle of Europe, with dalliances elsewhere in the globe. The other is a war which is dictated by the pace of movement of logistics ships and convoys of supplies of ammunition and food going to the different theatres around the globe, dictating who will win and who will lose what battle's coming. Because at the ultimate point is, if you have 100,000 artillery shells and I have none, you have a significant advantage in any fight. And then we have the leaders of this battle. Now, at this point I'm probably going to be surprising because people are going to, hang on, Halsey, this is Halsey's area of command. He's pushing things forward, and yes, Nimitz is marshaled Halsey. Halsey's in the command of sort of I would say we have different gradients of strategic. We have geostrategic, which is global. We have theatre, and then we can have sub-theatre, or sometimes we can divide it up at various points. Some people insert this thing called the operational level. Not quite sure why they insist on inserting things, because you have tactical, you have strategic, and you have geostrategic over that has always been sort of something around when it was called grand strategy or these sort of things. So there's always something around those phrases coming into it. But realistically, you have the fleet, you have the forces which Halsey's in charge of, but of those, it's 7th Fleet, and it's 7th Fleet which is taking decisions, and it's Kinkaid, who is a wonderful character and a very interesting admiral for the US Navy, who is, at this point, technically a rear admiral, but brevet vice admiral, who's in charge of the force involved. And on the Japanese side, it's our old friend Chuishi Nagumo doing what he does best, trying to push forward. And he does do it well. He does do it well. No, he doesn't. He's a conservative attacker. He really is, but he is an offensively minded conservative attacker. It's one of those things. He does a very conservative offense of operations, and that's how he works. That's how it is for him. Now these two are going to go head to head against each other in command of their various forces. The IJN's force is slightly more expansive, as you'd expect from a force which is trying to push in and dictate a land battle. But that doesn't necessarily give it the edge, though. Whilst it does bring 2 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 4 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, that's 8 8-inch cruisers, 2 6-inch cruisers, 2 light 24 destroyers to the battle, and nearly 200 aircraft on those arraigned on those carriers. And the Americans bring 2 fleet carriers, a battleship, 3 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 14 destroyers, and 136 aircraft. Those stats don't really reveal all the details and all the data that you have there, and all the capabilities you have there. I would argue the Americans, because they've been able to leave the construction just that much later, have been able to achieve a technological edge in their force structures. And I would also argue that the IGN, through pursuing, for reasons of their doctrine, which I've discussed in other videos on this channel, Japanese Naval Aviation doctrine and all sorts of things, and the Kantai Kessen, etc. discussion videos have all discussed it and got into their doctrine and topics. They do like to pursue the perfect weapon system. And this has meant that sometimes they don't pursue the good enough, or what I would call the general purpose. The dual purpose. And so this means that the American forces ends up being slightly more effective. I'd also argue that the American fleet, structured as it is, based around 2 Yorktown-class carriers with their supporting assets, is also more homogeneous to support and strengthen. It's got Porters, it's got Mahans, it's got Lanters, it's got Sims. It has got a Benson and a Gridley, but, you've got to have to bring along the variety in terms of destroyers. And the cruisers, well, the US heavy cruiser program was always interesting. It was, for many years, not producing enough ships at all. And they were more, as I've discussed in the Year of the Cruisers, they are more scout cruisers than they are heavy cruisers. In fact, that's pretty much what they were until the first London Treaty comes along and goes, suddenly everything with an 8-inch gun is a heavy cruiser. You sort of look at the cruisers produced in the 1920s that will have 8-inch guns. They're not heavy cruisers. I wouldn't class the county class as heavy cruisers. I'd class them as large light cruisers. That's what they were designed as. That's what their whole theory behind their construction, their armouring, and their operation was going to be. I definitely wouldn't say the Northamptons or the Pensacola's or even the Portlands were in any way, shape or form heavy cruisers. They are scout cruisers. That's what they were building at the time. They were for the scout force. And their shape, form, and basically organisation represents that. But still, they're good ships. They're good ships. Both sides are armed with a range of dive bombers, fighters, and torpedo bombers. I would say the US force is slightly lighter on the torpedo bombers in proportion to the rest of the other aircraft, but both sides are probably not carrying enough fighters. Both sides have their own issues going on. And both sides are bringing particular advantages to bear. For the IJN, their forces are divided into 3 groups. An advanced force, under direct command of Vice Admiral Nobukari Kondo. And then you've got the carrier striking force, which is under Nagumo, which is struck around, well, is organised around 2 fleet carriers and a light carrier. The advance force also has a carrier with it, and, well, it actually starts off with 2 carriers with it, but the Hio has to go off to Truk on the 22nd of October. So by the time the battle comes, it's a long way away with some of its escorts. And this means that their force divided into 3, with the battleships sitting in the Vanguard group and in the advance force. Oh, how do I put this politely? Spread about. Their force structure is divided. Definitely divided. And again, this is the Japanese continuing on with a methodology which they have from prior to World War II. They have all sorts of ideas of how to do their ambush methodology, and that's dictated there, especially their night ambush work, a lot of their force maneuver formations and a lot of their force structuring. And when the war hasn't worked out that way, it's probably time to look at your structuring and see whether it works. But the thing is, that's what they've practiced. That's what they have memorized. That's what they have downwrote. And so they keep to it. In contrast, the Americans have formed up 2 battle groups around their 2 carriers. And whilst there is a South Dakota class there, that's really just there to basically go, we have a battleship. We have something with us. And in some ways, it's actually making up for the absence of a heavy cruiser in the screen of Task Force 16. I'm not sure what would have happened if the South Dakota had ended up engaging the Congos in any kind of meaningful battle. But I have a feeling if it had been a night action, even solo on 4, my money would be on the South Dakota. Because 9 16-inch guns and the various fire control systems she carries make for a convincing argument. However, that didn't happen. This was going to be an entirely aviation battle. And one of the reasons why it is this formation, why the Americans only have these ships, is because, sadly, they'd already lost a carrier. The Wasp had been sunk on the 15th, torpedoed and sunk on the 15th of September. And whilst I am not the world's biggest fan of the Americans' attempts to produce a full fleet carrier on a light fleet carrier's size and scale in the interwar years, honestly, the Wasp was the one I have the most time for and is probably the better of the 2 options. And her loss in such a way is rather sad, because she would have been very useful in this contest, in this battle. She would have evened the odds considerably, and she would have probably made for some useful advantages in terms of the deployability of firepower and the speed of generating firepower. It's amazing what the extra flight decks can achieve when you have them. A 3rd flight deck in this operation would be a 50% increase in force. That's useful. With that in mind, when we get into the next topic, well, we're setting the stage, aren't we? We're setting the stage for the battle, for what's going to happen. And the thing is, the Americans are, to an extent, reading the Japanese playbook. They do have an idea what the Japanese are going to do, and they set themselves up for this. You can argue the first stage setting is the replacement of Gormley. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, who was the commander in the South Pacific area. He'd been doing an okay job, but frankly, Nimitz was feeling he was a bit too pessimistic and myopic, and a few other things which are far ruder. Pretty much Nimitz basically had decided that this man has decided he's been defeated by the Japanese. And that's obviously not the case, because there's literally oodles and oodles of resources coming down the pipeline, and so far, whilst we've lost battles, they have lost resources at a far greater rate than we have, so we're not losing this. We're not winning, necessarily, at the moment yet, but we're not losing. And for Japan, America not losing is the same thing as them losing, because they need America to lose to stand a chance of winning. At this point, Halsey's put in charge, and Halsey basically goes, well, I'm going to start throwing punches. He's always been a bit of a prize fighter, and there he is. And in this scenario, well, they have an idea. They know that Yamato is going to be sending his ships there. He wants to try to make up for defeat at the Battle of Midway. Again, this is the other trouble. The Japanese kept getting how do I put this politely again? Getting worked up by their defeats and their losses. They take them personally. And there is some truth in the line that you should take your victories and your defeats with the same emotion. Your victories, they're moments of, we did it. And your defeats are moments of, we did it better. If you do it well. If you do it well. And so they start arranging forces. Nimitz has put in someone who is going to put all his effort into supporting the front forces, and he's also got Kinkaid there. And as I mentioned also earlier, Kinkaid is a pretty good admiral and a pretty good officer to have there. And so when the Japanese start heading into the region and start being part of the operations and start getting involved from roughly the 11th of October onwards and trying to support the operations to attack the Henderson Field, the American carrier forces are moving into place. They sweep in just from the north of Santa Cruz on the 25th of October. And they are searching for US forces. They are in there to attack, to take them out, and to hit them. There is even a sort of understanding going on that the odds are they're going to be outnumbered. But the idea is if they can use their own mobility, if they can use the anonymity of the sea to their advantage, they can hit the Japanese forces. Add that they have other advantages thanks to the forces ashore, what they've been achieving. There's a PBY Catalina reconnaissance aircraft going around, and these actually locate the Japanese main body, locate the Japanese carriers on the 25th of October. The Japanese realise they've been spotted, though, and the Japanese do what was very sensible to do. We're going to withdraw. And the thing for the Americans is they don't have the night attack capability. This is one of those really interesting things about this battle, is if the Americans had had the same level of night strike capability as the British, or the Japanese had the same level as the British, in terms of their aviation assets, this could have been a really bitter night fight. For the Japanese, it could have been total wipeout of their force at night, with the Americans having no losses in return. For the Japanese, it's rather similar. If they had managed to launch a night strike on the American forces, they couldn't have lost anything at this point, because both sides are actually weak at it. They don't have enough training. They don't have enough depth of knowledge and spread of knowledge amongst their forces. They have people who are very skilled at night operations, but they are very few and far between, and the units which are wholly trained up to operate together and operate as a cohesive force at night are even rarer. And that's a problem for both sides. It means the night is off the table, so the Japanese are withdrawing out of range, and the Americans... Well, the Americans are trying to find the Japanese carriers. They did launch a strike force, but when night came, they went back to the carriers. And so it's the 26th of October when the battle begins. It's the 26th of October when we start seeing the operations. And it starts early. The Japanese reverse course at nearly 3 a.m., about 0250 hours, on 26th of October. The funny thing is, about 20 minutes later, a radar-equipped Catalina PBY spotted them. Unfortunately, the report doesn't reach Kinkaid till 05... Well, pretty much 0515 hours. I do love it. There is one book I read which is put 0512. And another one said 20 past. And another one said about approximately quarter past. So I'm going to go with quarter past. But it could be as early as 0512. It could be as late as 20 past 5. Honestly, those few minutes, it matters to an extent, but not massively. Because they already had both fleets aircraft out hunting each other, and honestly, by about 5 a.m., they were roughly 200 nautical miles away from each other. Which in carrier fighting range is not night fighting range, but it is getting on the closer side. 300 nautical miles is usually sort of within that zone. When you're well within that zone, yeah, it's kind of like when you're fighting a battleship in any of the computer games, World of Warships or Ultimate Dreadnoughts or anything like that, and you're in secondary range. The primary armament's going to have a real fun time fighting you because you are well within its targeting scope by that point. There is not as much error going to take place then because they can see you and they can report the full shot so accurately. This probably explains why it takes till roughly 7 a.m., between 6:40 and 7 a.m., that the US sight Nagumo, a US SATGAT aircraft from one of their carriers sights Nagumo's main body, and within a few minutes, and in the same period, a Japanese scouting aircraft spots Hornet's task force. Both sides then, of course, are an absolute mess of activity to launch everything. To launch everything as quickly as they can. And the really interesting thing are the list of strikes you get in this operation. That first wave from Nagumo's carrier force against Hornet would include 21 A6M Zeeks, 21 Achi D3A Val dive bombers, so 21 fighters, 21 dive bombers, and 22 B5N Kate torpedo bombers. 2 of those were working as navigational aids only. They weren't going into attack, they were acting as navigational support. And 9 of the fighters had to divert to attack incoming aircraft, which were going to attack their carrier group. Which is, again, sensible. So it means that your ultimate strike package is realistically, at this point, 12 fighters, 21 dive bombers, and 20 torpedo bombers. Now, there are going to be multiple other ways, and one of the things that happens, as said, is they basically spotted each other at roughly the same time, and guess what? The first wave from Hornet that launches has 8 Wildcats for F4F fighters, 15 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and 6 torpedo bombers, Avengers. It's again a fairly decent strike package. One of the interesting things is when people start talking about strike packages and carriers, they presume the entire carrier group's going up. Well, the first attack on Hornet is from multiple carriers. The same with their second wave when attacking Enterprise. The same with a lot of their operations, they come from multiple carriers. So that's where those numbers, those sort of 60-odd aircraft being launched, coming from. It's multiple carriers generating that. And from the Americans, well, these are coming from individual ships. So we're talking 29, that's, aircraft from Hornet, and then a further, a further 20 aircraft from Enterprise. And then the third wave that comes from US comes from Hornet again, and that's another 26 aircraft. So Hornet's actually launching consistently more aircraft. But Enterprise is still doing well, and they're also launching fighters for air defense and fighters for other things going on. But this is the reality of the strikes. It's one of the reasons why I find it funny when people start talking about British, American, and Japanese carriers, and they start talking about the strikes, and they talk about the air groups being the entire strike force. No, that's not. That's the pool of aircraft you're drawing from. You could launch the same size strike from a British carrier as an American carrier as a Japanese carrier. It would be the same, roughly 30 aircraft, 20 to 30 aircraft. The difference is the proportion of the air group that might be drawing from, and the difference is perhaps, and this is going to sound strange again, the mix, because of how they orientate their air groups. And of course the British sort of don't have many dive bombers in service through the war, because they start off with the skewers, then they don't really need them in the Mediterranean campaign, and by the time they're in the Pacific, they're just loading up with Avengers and heavy fighters armed with all those things, and they're sort of skipping the dive bomb. Or despite the fact that they are one of the ones who are most obsessed with dive bombing in the 1920s and 30s and trying to push to get to it. But no, the Battle of Santa Cruz starts off with this fighting. The strikes land on their carriers and manage to find their carriers that they are targeting at about the same time. And what you also have to remember is you can be launching the first strike, and then you're preparing the second strike before the first strike is even hit. So it takes them about 2 hours to launch the first strike, and then they're launching the second strike, and they're raining them up. And again, why are you doing this? Because the first strike may hit their target, they may not, they may miss. The second strike may hit the target, may not. But you're probably going to need more than one strike to knock out a task force. And if you keep all the aircraft over the air while you're assembling up a mega strike and all those aircraft combined, they're going to run out of fuel circling around. So this is, again, the reality of generating this aircraft and generating these strike groups across multiple carriers to launch them. It's a time of generation. It's the time of getting them off the decks. Broadly speaking, the US strikes are running roughly 20 to 30 minutes behind the Japanese, depending on which aircraft and which troops we're talking about. More commonly, you will find sources relating to 20 minutes, but there's actually a bit of a spread. Because it depends if you're going from the first Japanese aircraft to leave to the last American ones to leave, or the last Japanese aircraft to leave to the first American ones to leave. And so it's more accurate to say it's a 20 to 30 minute spread, broadly speaking, behind. But they do have some luck. And that is that the opposing aircraft strike formations actually pass within sight of each other. And yes, the Zeros, the Zeeks from Zahio go and attack the Enterprise strike group, climbing sort of out of the sun and then attacking them from there, which causes 4 Zeros to be lost, 3 Wildcats, and two of the Avengers to be shot down. Another 2 Avengers and a Wildcat forced to return to Enterprise. But those 9 Zeros then had to withdraw from action as well. And it's at roughly 0900 hours, roughly, the Americans start attacking the Japanese, and their aircraft reach them, and at roughly the same time, the Japanese force are sighting and attacking the Hornet task force. The Enterprise's task force was having usual Enterprise luck. They were hidden by a rain squall. They were nicely tucked away. Now, we're going to concentrate on the American strike first because, well, the Japanese one goes on for a bit longer and has more layers in some regards. But the American ones, they have their plans they're going in. Unfortunately, those plans don't necessarily work. Now, the idea was always that the escorting fighters should draw away enemy fighters to stop them interfering with dive bombers and torpedo bombers attacking. But the trouble is, the Zuhaio's fighters attack the Wildcats and draw them away. And thus, the dive bombers then go into their attack, and while they're doing their attack, 12 more Zeeks, 12 more Zeros, and remember, it's Zeke was what they're officially called, but Zero is what we tend to call them, and for some reason my brain has decided it's going to keep switching between the two. I do not know why. I was keeping quite good as Zeeks the other day, so I'm trying to keep to that. Attack that formation. So basically, 3 Zeros, 3 Zeeks, have drawn them off. Have drawn off the Wildcats, leaving the SBDs on their own to be attacked by 12 fighters. See a problem here? It's not necessarily a bad problem. It's people doing what they're technically supposed to do. They're supposed to go for draw for the fighters, but you need to somehow you need to basically have more of command and control, more coordination. You need to have the experience you get with operations. And with the dive bombers going in unescorted, they lose 2, and 2 more are forced to abort. But more importantly, when the 11 dive bombers start attacking Shikaku at 0927 hours, they hit it with roughly 3 to 6 bombs. there is a debate about how many. And debate about how close some of those other 3 bombs they might have been hit were. And some, well, one of them, SBDs, lost track of Shikaku while it was almost in its dive and dropped his bomb near the Teruzuki, which was a destroyer escorting the Shikaku. 6 Avengers, which were in the first strike force, they did not find the Japanese carriers and eventually just turned back towards Hornet. But they do find the Tone on their way back, but they miss with all their torpedoes. Now, the Avengers of the second attack formation, which was from the Enterprise, were also unable to locate Japanese carriers, and they managed to find the Susiana, the heavy cruiser, but again caused no damage. Whilst they were doing this, 9 SBDs from the third US attack, this was from the second strike from Hornet, found the ships and managed to attack the Chikuma, the heavy cruiser, hitting her with 2,000-pound bombs, which did cause heavy damage. 3 then Enterprise SBDs then arrived and also decided to attack the Chikuma, but caused some more damage with 1 more bomb hit and 2 near misses. And finally, 9 TBFs, which had been completely lost, that's 9 Avengers, which had been completely lost, and they were also in the third strike group, arrived and decided also focusing on the Shikuma. They were attacking with bombs, and they scored 1 more hit, which meant the Shikuma, escorted by 2 destroyers, withdrew and headed towards Truk for repairs. And this is not really going the way they want it to, is it? And it's at this point we switch to look at what the Japanese are achieving versus the Americans. The big difference you have going on is that at 08:55 hours, the US carriers had detected the approaching Japanese aircraft on their radar. This was roughly 35 nautical miles away, and they began to therefore orientate their fighters, and the usual phrase we always use is vectoring fighters to engage the incoming Japanese aircraft. However, there are problems with this. There are problems which will ultimately get sorted out after this battle once you have the experience of Saratoga and HMS Victorious working together, or as she was called, USS Robin, during that time. In that, their procedures are interesting. They haven't worked them out through. They haven't thoroughly tested them through. And the fighter control directors don't necessarily understand how they're maneuvering it. What came up a lot in the discussions that seems to have had up for this is the experience the British had and the experience the British had been training for in the 1920s and 30s, where they started developing this, was teaching directors to not necessarily plot a straight course of the aircraft to their target, but to plot the best course for the aircraft to their target, so you're giving the best chance of engagement. And going straight towards, your enemy's here, go here. No, you might want to go off to one angle and go high so you can dive down, add an angle so you have the best engagement chance. So your vectoring is not going enemy here, go there. You might be going there to attack from here. And those sort of things, maneuvers we do with fighters. And that's stuff you learn, okay? Because the obvious thing when you're starting out and you're putting is go straight to there. And in exercises, that can be fine because you're going to, exercise rated kills or yes, we are counting this many were killed by this many intercepting fighters. Then in real life, you go, oh, that false positive, the exercises didn't work. Oh, we now need to fix this. The US CAP does its best. They are able to shoot down a lot of Japanese aircraft, but the vast majority of Japanese aircraft were completely untouched by the US fighters because the US fighters were not in the best position to engage them. As such, the AA guns of Hornet and her task group are opening fire on roughly 20 Japanese torpedo aircraft and another 16 odd dive bombers that commencing their attack simultaneously pretty much on the carrier. That's not a good scenario. You're not going to be surprised at what I'm going to say next, are you? Of the attack, 3 bombs and a dive bomber itself that was set on fire by the air guns smashed into the deck. And as they were doing this, 20 torpedo bombers, as said. 20. Think about that. Think about that sheer number of torpedoes which are going to be heading your way. We're approaching from roughly 2 different spread directions. Which means you, I think if I remember correctly, it was 11 on one side, 9 on the other side, pretty much of axis of attack, and they were almost opposite to each other. They're coming in. Unsurprisingly, therefore, Hornet gets hit by multiple torpedoes, and at that point, she's then hit by another Japanese dive bomber crashing into their side, which started a fire in the ship's supply aviation fuel. By the time the Japanese had finished their attack, Hornet is dead in the water and burning. And yes, there are escorting destroyers, cruisers, everyone doing their best to try and evacuate personnel and try and tow the Hornet from the battle area. But in the end, there are more Japanese attacks inbound, and that carrier is sitting there unable to do anything. And the thing is, that's a hard-won lesson. That is a hard-won lesson. You've just lost a Yorktown-class carrier. And you've lost it through not making any mistakes according to your doctrine, according to your policy. So that's always the hardest lesson of all. You've done the very best you can, and you are expected to do under these circumstances, and it still hasn't worked out. Your carrier was zigging and zagging. You were doing all the best you can to avoid the bombers, avoid the dive bombers and torpedo bombers. Your fighters were up there doing a cap, everything. Combat air patrol was cap was going about and all this stuff, and still they got through. And still they got through. And that's pretty much all it wrote for Hornet. Yeah, she's on fire for the rest of the day. I've discussed in various videos, another video on carrier losses and carrier damage control, exactly the story that goes through with her and her experience of trying to get out alive. And, well, there's a reason she doesn't. And honestly, the odds were stacked against her around that point because she'd taken that much damage. At 09:30 hours, Enterprise is landing her cap. She's landing in as many fighters as she can. She's taking on as many aircraft as she can. Hornets aircraft, anything. Why? Because you do. Because you want as many fighters airborne as possible, and frankly, it doesn't matter where they came from. It's better than having them ditch in the sea. They're far more useful on your deck, getting rearmed and getting put up in the air again. They detected Japanese aircraft, a second wave coming in at 09:30 hours. The second wave. Remember what I said about you launch 2 waves to make sure you get your get your survival and to make sure you have a chance. Well, yeah. The second wave are coming in, and the first wave's already rocked Hornet's world. And Enterprise, therefore, stops landing aircraft at 1000 hours. At this point, fuel-depleted aircraft have to ditch in the ocean, but the reason they're doing that, and the escort destroyers are trying to rescue the aviators, the reason they're trying to do that, they're doing that, is to free up the carrier for its maneuvers to defend itself. You have to remember, when a carrier is recovering or launching aircraft, it has to maneuver in such a way to benefit the aircraft. It can't do that and be dodging enemy bombers. So at this point, things like the damaged Avenger, which had been attacked earlier, has to crash in the water next to USS Porter, and she rescues her. But it's as she's rescuing this this air crew, she's actually hit by a torpedo. Probably, potentially from a ditched aircraft, potentially a Japanese one which was still running, and this torpedo causes damage to USS Porter. And so, well, it's then USS Shaw which has to sink USS Porter with gunfire. Now, the problem for the Enterprise was that as the aircraft from the first strike on which had hit Hornet had been going back, that squall had died down, and they had spotted her task force and reported that carrier's position. And as such, the second strike wave, which were believing quite rightly that Hornet was out of the count, some believed it was sinking, but let's be honest, it's out of the count. It is lost, but it's, it ends up, it's a whole saga of what happens to the Hornet. Decided to go and focus in on Enterprise, which is not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea. It's sensible. Hornet's not doing anything at this point. Hornet's not a threat to anyone. At this point, therefore, the Cap from the US Navy are trying to intercept the Japanese aircraft before they do it. They reach the Enterprise, and they're doing a slightly better job this time. They've learnt some lessons, but they're still not doing great. And they managed to get only 2 of the 19 dive bombers as they dive on their carrier. Thankfully, Enterprise has Enterprise luck. And the 1st Division scores no hits. The 2nd Division scored a hit on the carrier with 2 250-kilogram semi-armor piercing bombs. They killed 44 men and wounded 75. They caused damage to the carrier, including her forward elevators jammed in the up position, which is good for being able to launch and recover aircraft. It's better than being jammed in the lower position. And they achieved near misses with her bombs. But 10 of the bombers are lost in this attack, and they didn't achieve anything else. Those hits were it. And it's not till 20 minutes later that the torpedo bombers arrive. So it's not a simultaneous attack, not like the Hornet suffered. Hornet had torpedo bombers and dive bombers at the same time. It's 20 minutes later they turn up for Enterprise. And again, these get attacked by the Wildcats. But those getting attacked, one of them decides to crash into the USS Smith, setting the ship on fire and killing 57 of her crew, a destroyer. And it was... well, how to put this? The torpedo bomber actually hit, and the torpedo hadn't been dropped and hadn't gone off, but it detonated shortly after it had been there, which caused more damage. But it hadn't dropped its torpedo, it had just literally gone, I'm on fire, I'm going to crash into that ship. We can consider the sensibility of that, necessarily. But the fires were pretty much getting out of control until they steered themselves into the wake of the USS South Dakota, which, helpfully as any battleship was providing a relatively large spray. That helped the USS Smith put out the fires and return to her anti-aircraft duties against the torpedo aircraft. And South Dakota was always happy to get a firefighting badge. At least I hope they got their firefighting badge. They put out the fire on another ship with their own wake. They deserve the firefighting badge. It's just cruel if they haven't. That's what they deserved. Sadly, though, that's not the end of the attacks on Enterprise, and South Dakota, and Portland. In fact, that's where all the torpedo planes sort of divide their love between those 3 vessels. But all their torpedoes miss or fail to causing no damage. the entire engagement, as far as the American carriers at this point, is over pretty much by 1100 hours. And that's the 2 strikes dealt with. Enterprise gets back into service quite quickly. She'd had fires on her flight deck and some in her hangar, but she managed to get most of them out of the way. And by 11:15 or 11:15 hours, she is managing to land the returning aircraft from the morning strikes. Now, unfortunately, this is when the third strike of next strikes of Japanese aircraft start to turn up. If you remember the order of battle, there was the carriers in Nagumo's force, but there was also another carrier, Hio class, the Junyo, which was with the Vanguard. It was off being the advanced force. And, well, they had arrived at 0900 hours, roughly, at this point, roughly 280 nautical miles from the US carriers. As mentioned earlier, you have a strike area of roughly up to 300 nautical miles in World War II. That's roughly what you're normally looking at. The British do plan for longer range strikes than that at night, but the British are weird. They're the ones who have the faith in their navigation and believe they can do it. They do, to be fair, they do pull off some very impressive long range night strikes, so it's not completely impossible, but I'd say against a moving fleet target, I would not like to have done it. I think you would have probably been searching for nothing. But it's still possible, and within 300 nautical miles, definitely viable. And she launches 17 dive bombers and 12 of her fighters to go and do their best against the US carriers. These arrive at 11:20 hours and dive on Enterprise. They've managed to avoid being picked up by radar as well, it seems. Primarily, I think, because they were coming from a different direction, and they're coming when aircraft are returning. There's all sorts of mess going on around them within roughly 35-40 nautical miles anyway, which is the effective range, realistically, of the radar at that point. At the altitudes the aircraft were operating at, they managed to basically get in without being detected, it seems. And they focus in on Enterprise. They score a near miss on her. They managed to score a hit on South Dakota, a hit on San Juan, the light cruiser. Well, the Atlanta class light cruiser, I think, yes. And, well, on the South Dakota, the bomb hit number 1 turret, and surprisingly, it failed to penetrate, considering the amount of metal which is on number 1 turret. But 2 men were killed, and 50, including the ship's commanding officer, were wounded by fragments, where it shows that the trouble is there's still a lot of stuff outside of the armor which can get hurt. They caused issues. The bomb caused issues, but she could carry on her work. At 11:35 hours, this is after this strike is over. Hornet is, of course, out of action. Enterprise is heavily damaged, in the view of its damage control officers. The Japanese were assumed by Kinkaid to have at least 1, if not 2, undamaged carriers in the area, and realistically, they have 3 at this point. Kinkaid decides to withdraw, leaving Hornet behind. They recover as many aircraft as they can. And that's it. They're trying to withdraw. It's at this point the Japanese start trying to move in for the kill. They start trying to launch more strikes, and they do launch more strikes. And these strikes attack Hornet. Again, I've done a video about damage control on carriers and the scenario they had, and basically every time Hornet feels she's getting just about viable and can maybe get her way out of there, she's attacked again and again and again. And of course Enterprise is steaming away. In many ways, Hornet is paying for Enterprise's escape by being a target, being a focal target. And the ships left behind to try and look after her are the same. They are the focal target. The Americans have a lot of problems in this battle. But there's a problem overall with all of this. Victory is not victory. And by the way, the reason this is set up is because of this picture. This is Wasp, which had been sunk a few days prior. And this is why the Americans have gone from having free carriers in this region to full fleet carriers, and Wasp, which is an attempt to fit a fleet carrier onto a light carrier size. Some interesting ideas and technological innovations notwithstanding, it's not necessarily the best idea. But they tried that, and she's an interesting vessel. But she's really not enough carrier for what they needed to do. They really needed a full-sized Yorktown. But the thing is, she'd been lost. And now Hornet's lost. And now Enterprise is really damaged again. Enterprise has already been damaged once. She's damaged again. This is a problem. This is a scenario where realistically the Americans have definitely not won this fight. Despite Americans claiming they'd sunk 2 Shikaku-class fleet carriers, and Kinkaid even claimed hits to a battleship, 3 heavy cruisers, and a light cruiser, and possibly another carrier. In reality, Shikaku, Zuhao, and Shikuma are the only Japanese ships which are hit during the battle, and none of them are sunk. They're damaged, but none are sunk. The Japanese, the IJN, claimed never once to be bashful. They'd sunk 3 American carriers, which is interesting because I'm not sure where that extra aircraft carrier came from. 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, and 1 destroyer, and 1 identified large warship. American losses, of course, the Hornet and the Porter, with the Enterprise damaged, along with the San Juan, the Smith, and the South Dakota, all receiving various levels of damage. The reality is, though, the Japanese had managed to win this fight. They managed to push the Americans back. They managed to push the American carrier forces back. They managed to push it to the scenario where the Americans do not have carriers realistically available for operations. However, there is a problem going on here, in that they have lost in this operation a lot of aircrew. The thing is, the fighters may not have been in good positions to stop them getting in, but they were in very good positions to stop them getting out. This combined with Japanese aircrew having a interesting focus on their targets. This is pre-kamikaze, remember, but still, it's an interesting level of target fixation, and you're left with a scenario where they have lost a lot. And that's a problem. That's a very big problem. The Japanese have, as I've said at the beginning of this video, been winning battles in ways which they are losing the war. Yay, we won the battle. We've lost so much resources. Can we repair any of it? Nope. Can we replace it? Nope. What's happened to our crew qualities? Don't go down. There is a reason why at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is one of the largest in terms of area of coverage battles ever seen in the history of naval warfare, and by tonnage one of the largest battles I've ever seen. There is a reason why Japanese aircraft carriers play an auxiliary role in it. They've had their force spent. They've had their value eroded by operations like this, where they win a victory, but they don't really win anything. Because the thing is, they got control of this. They had the carriers and they had the capability. So This is one of the reasons why both the USN and the IJN end up deploying battleships in night operations around Guadalcanal. But the thing is, even with the carrier dominance they'd achieved thanks to this operation, and they couldn't bring those carriers, they couldn't bring those combined forces in, and they couldn't bring enough troops in, amphibious forces, to wrest back control of Guadalcanal. They've just expended all that, and they can't do the very thing they need to do to win Guadalcanal, which is deploy a whole lot of ground troops with heavy equipment and overwhelm the American positions. Whilst you've got a dominance, whilst you're able to dictate the operations at sea, because you've got work carriers and the Americans haven't available at this point, you need to. And this leads us to the really big problem, which I've alluded to at several points in this video, but I want to really emphasize. In this attack, according to some of the figures from Lundstrom, well, the Japanese lost 99 out of 203 aircraft involved in battle. They lost 148 pilots and aircrew. And that included 10 senior officers, which is really, really bad. But it adds out, once you're looking through the figures, 49% roughly of the Japanese torpedo bomber crews, 39% of the dive bomber crews, 20% of the fighter crews. The Japanese lost more personnel, more aircrew in Santa Cruz than they had lost in Coral Sea, Midway, and East Solomons. They lost more. And the thing is, after these battles combined, and this is Mark Petey's really killer fact from Sunburst, 409 of the 765 aviators who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor were now dead. Their critical force, the really best of the best they had, and they have lost by October 1942, 409 out of 765. That is about 55% of them gone already. Think about that. So yes, this is a victory. But Nagumo, as I said, sorry, dog overeating quickly in the background. His view was that the battle was a tactical win, but a shattering strategic loss. And that comes from Hara's Japanese destroyer captain, which is an interesting read to read through, and has some really interesting quotes in it. I don't think, though, it qualifies as a Pyrrhic victory, and I say in its wider impact on the war, it leads to the whole USS Robin scenario, which is a very great thing to learn from, and until I do a video on it, I would highly recommend going to see Armoured Carrier's video on it. It's a really interesting watch. But the USS Robin scenario basically leads to a closer integration of the Royal Navy and the US Navy, and they're working together, and a greater understanding. It forms, in many ways, that operation, that experience is the foundation for a lot of what will eventually become doctrine and operational competence within NATO. It's amazing how much of NATO stems back to the discussions had between the forces in that time of how to work and operate together. But the impact on the wider war is, at this point, Japan has lost all offensive ability in terms of naval aviation. To regenerate the level of naval aviation capable will take longer than the Americans will give them. Longer than they have. Especially if they continue down the same lines they always have done. And that's the problem they're going to. They will do that. They will keep pushing down those lines. They will always do that. Because that has served them so well in the past. One of the problems is, and I discussed this in the Japanese naval aviation video, is that the Japanese had a very successful early career in naval aviation. And that, along with an experience of World War One, which was not the same as the rest of the nations involved, meant that they stuck with those policies because they'd served them so well. They had seemed to deliver everything they wanted. And this is where it comes in. The impact of Santa Cruz on the wider war, and in summary, the battle itself. It's a battle which in many ways shouldn't have had to been fought. If the Japanese had properly secured Guadalcanal, it would have taken far longer for the Americans to mount a force to attack it. But as it was so minimally garrisoned, it was so minimally prepared, that frankly the Americans could afford to take a risk. And by the time the Japanese turned up, the Americans had reinforced that. And even once they use their naval power and managed to push the Americans as hard as they can, and they really did push them as hard as they could, they can't dislodge them. All they've done is confirm the value of the islands and their worth to the American government, the American people, and the Allies. All they've done is their worst scenario. Now, I finish these videos often with a question. And I have a question for you based on the Naval Aviation Doctrines videos, which I've done for the US, for the Royal Navy and the IJN. And I'd like you to watch those videos as well. And I'd like you to look at those doctrines and think this question. How would those nations have dealt with if the situation if they had had the situation reversed? If the Japanese had been the American forces in this scenario, and the Americans the Japanese forces, or if the British had been the Japanese and the Americans the Americans, or vice versa, or the British and the Japanese involved in each way. I'd like you to think about that, because that can give you a lot of ideas about the reality of the naval aviation doctrines as they were. As I've often said, there are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences, and some of those differences are quite subtle. And often the best way to discern and understand those similarities and differences is to look at an operation and think of how would you proceed if you were one or the other in that same position. And flipping the two sides around, well, that can lead to a very interesting discussion. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you everyone who's supporting, currently sending in super chats and all those things, and all the other donations, which are, as I said, all the funding this currently is going on bookshelves for the book collection. I will never not be shocked by the fact that my little office, the brew shack, contained enough books to fill out 8 4x2s and 2 4x3 calyxes, double stacked every single cube. It's just, even I didn't realise there were quite that many books in there. That was a lot of books. Anyway, thank you everyone for your kindness, and well, soon this whole sightline is going to change, because the legs will hopefully arrive, and after the next patron amount, and yeah, they will all be raised up a bit. Raised up just high enough that they will be safe from little puppies, their jaws, and to allow a Roomba to do a circuit, which is sensible with a certain member of the Fluffy Research Assistants who seems to produce the same volume of fluff as him, an equivalent volume of fluff, almost daily, judging by the amount I have to hoover up. I'm not talking about the poodle, thankfully. That would be even more fluff, but no, the corgi. The corgi produces enough. And what else we got coming up? Well, this week we have the French and other nations' World War II carrier naval aviation doctrine. Pre-war, II war. I'm going to be looking at the French Navy and the other potential carrier operating navies. The Soviets, well, I've already discussed them. But there are the Italians, and there are the Germans to come. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.